And as we started to get close, it kind of had that, for lack of a better word, the samurai chatter to it, but more with a primate grunt to it. My name is Stan Setner, and current member of the Bigfoot Mafia group here in Florida, but ultimately became interested in Bigfoot. Now, this is going to take me back just a little bit, but I was a young lad in the 70s and really got interested in Bigfoot from In Search of the Bogey Creek movie and Chariots of the Gods. Really got into the paranormal, cryptids, and everything from that generation that brought. There were just an array of movies that came out, as well as so I think Bogey Creek really is what drew me into it, and had an interest in UFOs, supernatural ghosts, and cryptids from that young age that really pushed me into what I'm doing now.
Well, tell me about what you're doing now.
So I do belong to Bigfoot Mafia, and we're here down in the Tampa area, North Tampa area. And there's many fine groups here in the Florida area that go out and looking for the skunk ape. We've also been out to Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, have some opportunities in other areas as well. But a lot of stuff we do individually. We do have weekends where we'll go out as a group and do group investigations, mainly within the Green Swamp area within Central Florida. But we have traveled the state from Myakka State Park all the way up through even getting into the panhandle of Florida. And a lot of stuff I end up doing, though, conversely, is a lot of times it's hard to get the group together just due to schedules and people's availability. So I end up going into the woods a lot by myself or with my wife, I'm very fortunate, to be honest with you, to have somebody who does participate and sees eye to eye with me in regards to that, and loves to get out in the woods. And really everything stems from my love for the outdoors and nature, and just getting out there. And so I think from the standpoint of looking for Bigfoot, skunk ape, whatever name you want to use, it just if anything at all, from the standpoint is, you see a lot of times where people will post success stories as far as getting out in the woods and finding things, and 95% of the time when we get out there, you really don't have a lot of success. I mean, there's a lot of things that have to go right. I believe opportunities, right place, right time. So 95% of the time we get out there, we don't really find anything. But it's that small percentage that when you do get out there, you have experiences that happen that keep kind of drawing you in. But ultimately, you have to love nature. You have to be able to love to get outdoors and spend your time out there and just enjoy what you're experiencing. And then if you get any results, footprints, noises, if you happen to get a Class A sighting, that's just the icing on the cake at that point.
Have you ever had a sighting?
Well, yes and no. So I'm going to say I've had a Class B sighting. And when I get into a Class B sighting, it was from a distance. So you were looking at about a 350-yard distance. My wife and I had gone out to St. Augustine. And on the way back, just south of Palatka, coming down 19, getting in the north end of the Ocala National Forest, there's a trail back there that we decided to stop at and just kind of, I'm one of those people that I'm in a car and I'm driving, and if I see a trailhead, I'm like, okay, where does this go? What, just always piques my curiosity. So countless times we've driven back and forth and have seen this trail. So this one time we create a little bit of extra time to stop and get out there. And at one point in time within Florida, they were doing something called the Big Dig, and they were trying to connect one side of the state from the Atlantic side to the Gulf side by digging out basically a waterway through both sides to get from one end. And they found that there was some issues that, so they kind of stopped it. But this trailhead kind of was right at that location. So when you came into the area there, you could see where they dug up on both sides of the waterway. There were mounds of dirt, probably about 30 feet high. And there's a trail on the back side, top side of that mound, and then on the lower side. So we decided to take the trail that paralleled the river that was there and started walking up. And as we kind of came around the bend, what caught my eye is you could see a figure, and this was a good distance. So it's, as I said, it's about 350 yards, completely in a orangish, bright, I wouldn't say bright red, but an orangish red. You could see the shoulders, the head, and it was all covered in red. Now, the way the sunlight was coming down in between the trees, you couldn't necessarily see its legs at point, but as it was walking through the sunlight, it would expose different areas of its arm, and you can tell arm, shoulder, back, and legs. And so as we were walking up, I mean, we were really quiet, but at some point you can notice it turned around, looked at us, and started to veer off into the woods. And as we were walking up, we continued to watch. It got kind of behind a tree that was in a V in the middle, and it would start peeking out behind the tree. And as we walked up, start peeking out, and it would kind of go, it was doing that on both sides of the tree. And so we were trying to make some distance to catch up, because roughly about 350 yards. And as we started to get closer, it disappeared. But when we got up to the tree, I could kind of do a perspective of the height. And we were looking at about 7.5 to 8 foot of where the head was in proportion to the wire of the tree. So that's kind of my sighting that I would say. But the distance is one of those factors where you question yourself after the fact, and you take a look and you say, did I really see what I saw? When I tried to rule out everything, it was the same body color. It was the same. The height was, based upon what we had seen was there, that no human would have been at that type of height. And so did I see something? Yes. Can I absolutely confirm that it was a skunk ape? No, but my suspicions based upon the evidence and what we had going, I'm going to say yes. But I've had plenty of Class B type of experiences over the past, since 2005, so 18 years.
So what are some others that you can tell us about?
So there's an area that we go down to. I'm just outside of the Tampa area in Florida, and we get out to the Green Swamp, which is kind of the notorious part. A lot of Class A sightings there, as well as Mayaca State Park, which is south of us. But there's an area of investigation that we do. It's kind of outside of Hillsborough County, and it's a corridor that leads into the Green Swamp from the Tampa area. And because of such, there's this particular area, there has been one Class A sighting. So that's kind of been our focal point, our main consistent point of where we go, and have either camped out, have done some gifting out there, as well as other things. But every experience I've had, I've been with my wife on this, and I can get into a few, but I'll start off with one. We were coming into the area early morning. It was like 6:30 a.m. and we heard what sounded like two people talking. And it was from a distance, maybe 500 yards, but it was in the area that we were walking. And we were walking, that would have been in a northerly direction. And it just sounded garbled, maybe like two grown men speaking, but you couldn't really audibly make out what these men were saying. And as we started to get close, roughly within about 150 yards, at this point, it kind of had that, for lack of a better word, the samurai chatter to it, but more with a primate grunt to it. It was like, and I'll kind of say do it, but it was like, And it really, the impression I had as I was talking with my wife, because we started approaching slow, it sounded like an adult speaking to a child. So you would hear this noise of ruckus like in the swamp because we were on trail, but anywhere in Florida at some point you're going to be in a swamp area. It doesn't matter, either left, right, you're eventually going to hit it. And you could hear what sounded like a smaller figure thrashing around, but they were moving towards the trail. And that was the noise we kept getting. It was one person, sounded like yelling at a child. I really have no other way to explain it, but and just kind of making that noise. And it's always one of those things when you get out into the woods, you want to start your video camera, you want to start your recorder, you want to do a lot of things. So this is going to be a really cool story because I didn't start my recorder. And so we kind of got to an opening. We could hear the noise, we could hear the chatter, and it was to our right. And it was behind a tree line. So we kind of split our distances up of about 50 yards, and I put my camera on, my video recorder, and my wife did the same. And we kept hearing this, and we're waiting for whatever it was to come out of the woods, and waiting. And then all of a sudden it just got quiet, and really nothing ended up happening. Didn't get that. But the next day I went out with a group of my group, the Mafia, and we went out there and we kind of looked for tracks. And of course, it was in a swampy area, but we did have a couple areas where you could tell there was a bed, there was some type of bedding. Now, it could have been a deer, but it was fairly large from the bedding stance of palm fronds being laid down, and where something had bedded down there. But like I said, this area is very notorious. Class A sightings been there. And we've had many other experiences there, from wood knocks, howl. We've had footprints. I've got a really good footprint story from that perspective. We've also had, I've had, I think, rocks tossed at me, and from various angles. But it's a very, very notorious area.
Well, can you tell me about the Class A sighting that was seen in that area?
Yeah, definitely. So this was reported through the BFRO, and there was a nature photographer who had gone out and goes out and photographs birds of the area, Florida birds. And he had gone out there, and it was during the day actually, and had set up his camera on a tripod, and had been focusing on a section that had some birds out there and was taking photos. And at that point, heard ruckus behind him and looked out and to his right, I believe, and saw what he believes was about a 7.5 to 8 foot Sasquatch or skunk ape cross the trail and went into the woods across. So that's kind of been the sighting. It's pretty close to the Tampa area, but it falls within this corridor that leads through the Hillsborough River and east into the Green Swamp.
I've heard Green Swamp is pretty active. Some other groups, I think, also go there and do quite a bit of research as well. So what do you think these things are?
Linda, that's a wonderful question. And, my opinion over the years has changed so much, and also from the evidence. So I do believe they're flesh and blood, but the more experience I hear from the paranormal side, and I can't say for sure if there's any. I mean, you get orbs with them, you get other things. So you really have to keep an open mind in this. I mean, really, does anybody know what Bigfoot is other than, the Patterson-Gimlin film and going out until we actually find a body or whatever the case may be. But I do believe in vibrational frequencies, and every, living object has a vibrational frequency. I do think that because of the vibrational frequencies, people that they could emit, that potentially there is a potential to make themselves invisible or blend in with the forest, or change from that perspective. But I do believe they're flesh and blood. I mean, when you do hear the stories across from the Pacific Northwest down in through the Northeast and just all the experiences. But I do have to preface it just from the standpoint of I'm starting to get into more of the paranormal aspect through our investigations.
Have you ever seen orbs in the areas that you believe they're active?
We have had some orb experiences, but when you get into the swamp, you get back into, if you get into Project Blue Book and whatnot, some of the experiences of what they've commented on. There is swamp gas out there, so I always want to preface: could it have been potentially swamp gas? Very well could have happened. We have seen lights that have moved in different directions, and without any type of reasoning to well, I guess I would say more of an intelligent movement as opposed to something just flying in a random pattern. So but trying to equate that to what we've had now. We've had howls, we've had knocks, and we've had witnessed an orb during that time frame. Is it tied to Bigfoot or Sasquatch? Hard to say, but it is coincidental, and you have to take that into consideration.
How about electronic failures? Have you had anything like that?
I guess more of the electronic failures have come in, and I put very little importance. I mean, you see a lot of investigators will put trail cams up, and I do think trail cams serve as a fundamental part of the investigation to see wildlife in the area and activity and movement between deers and foxes, raccoons, to kind of get a lay of the land through the feeding patterns that you can research. But there's been very few reports or videos from a trail cam that will pull in a Sasquatch. There's a potential, you see figures, but we've had experiences where trail cam has gone blurry or just quit recording, or also within any type of recording that we've done through our parabolic device, there has been some static that has came in from time to time during our investigation.
I've heard of weird situations happening with phones. Either they go dead, they ring out of nowhere, there's messages left, all kinds of weird things with phones. Have you had any of that?
Yeah, I'm going to have to tell you from that experience, I've yet to get anything from that. But there are other groups in the area that we collaborate with, and I know they've had some phone experiences that, especially there's some interesting things going on within the green swamp, especially with magnetic anomalies that people have been using devices on, such as your EMF devices. Now, is it correlated to potentially land lies from a magnetic standpoint? There's when you get into Florida, there's one area in Orlando that as a psychic hotspot you would kind of compare to Arizona, and so that is a magnetic landline there, and there's been some coincidences in relation to that. But I think more investigation work needs to be completed to try to tie stuff in.
What about structures? Have you found anything like that?
Absolutely. Structures are one of those things that I think is interesting, and you really get a lot of different opinions on. And I've listened to Todd Nace before about his interpretation on it, especially with Native American Indians and what their interpretations are. You do get a lot of postings from various groups, and even people who get tied into with groups posting photos of tree structures. And I try to take everything with a grain of salt. There's some stuff that definitely looks intelligent, where you have trees coming in from multiple angles, and that do look like they've been placed intelligently. But I will say it gets tough, because with the amount of evidence you see regarding tree structures from various groups, I think, you've got to factor into just the anomaly of Mother nature coming in and doing some random stuff, especially when you get into swamp areas with, the wetter ground and trees, the root systems becoming loose. But I think where you tend to see stuff like I had been out into West Green Swamp area, which is in Dade City, and there was a tree limb that was stuck into a tree with two branches placed like over the top that looked snapped. That one's a little bit more suspicious, but I think you've got to use everything with a grain of salt when it comes to structures, because if they're actually set up to denote either this is our area, stay away, or communicate with other Bigfoots, this is our clan, or we're here, or even from a birthing structure, maybe they use it as some form of birthing structure. I think interpretation can be done very loosely, but I do like the standpoint of going back to some of the native Indians and what their beliefs are, because and their interpretation of it. And I think that's a good reference that can be used to try to put some interpretation behind of what we see out there. And was it man-made? Is somebody doing bushcraft out there? And I guess it all comes down to where you see these structures at. Is it closer to the trail? Is it somewhere where you're 5-6 miles off a trail in the middle of nowhere, and you're coming upon a structure where very few people get? So everything has to be case by case basis, and then try to apply some rationale or scientific method to prove what you see out there. But there are a lot of structures out there, and I think though there's a lot of stuff that Mother Nature does on its own that could be random, that looks like there may be some intelligence behind it.
Do you often, when you find a structure and a footprint together, that would be, I assume, more confirming?
Yeah, definitely. And, and that's kind of the thing is, I believe footprints are very hard to find. I do think that, there's certain areas where you get out, especially the farther off trail, when you see stuff, because there's just certain areas and where maybe the ground is soft, there's less things, to cover it up, such as tree scrub, leaves, pine needles that come down that sometimes have a tendency to, cover those up. But you can definitely at times see imprints in there, but you will see breaks at certain levels where you come in and you'll take a look and, okay, this tree break is at a decent size. It's at 6.5, 7 foot up. There's really nothing surrounding that tree break that you could literally say that was done. The tree still looks alive. And then, that's where you got to kind of fan out and start looking and trying to piece some evidence together, and become from a tracking standpoint, to try to look at the tracking to see what you can come up with. And, you can see impressions within the ground. You can see it many times where something stepped on a stick on the ground, but you've got to really take a hard look at that and try to be very careful when you're walking in those areas. But to get it perfectly, to see where I think you're seeing a footprint and a tree break in the same area sometimes is a lot harder than it seems.
Yeah, I think you're right. What do you think about the evidence that is out there that Bigfoot exists? And what do you think is going to be the turning point where it's going to be more accepted?
Well, I think over the past 10 years, it's definitely become more of a novel across the United States. You do have a lot of people engaged in it, whether they're active in groups. I do think there's some good evidence. You with Dr. Meldrum, there's obviously his investigation of what's there. and you look at videos now, even taking a look at videos, there's so many skeptics out there. And I think one of the biggest things we have within this community too is the lack of sharing of information. Groups get very protective of their areas out there for one reason or another. Our group as a whole, we welcome it. I think the more saturation we can get within an area and to collect and gather evidence is, and share that amongst each other. But, that's our community as a whole tends to get very catty with one another. And, there's a lot of name calling and finger pointing, but there's a lot of great evidence with hair follicles, the casts and footprints, with Cliff Brackman's background with footprints, with Dr. Meldrum's, John Bendernagel's work. One of the guys that I really follow and I like listening to is Justin Cherepinski out in Canada, and he does a really good and honest job on how he produces evidence. But I think ultimately all these pieces that tie together that we get, whether it's follicles, breaks, structures, footprints, videos, within my mind, there's no doubt that there's something out there. There's just too many coincidences to say that there isn't. Is some of the stuff made up and falsified? Absolutely, when it comes to sightings, maybe videos that we get into. But really, ultimately, the same question I get posed when I tell somebody, hey, this is my hobby, and they get the chuckles out of the way, right? They get their laughs. They come in, well, I don't know if I believe it. We've got to have a body to prove. And I think ultimately, when you take a look at it, that's going to be, I think the biggest thing is either somebody videotapes an experience, like a one-on-one experience where the evidence is so clear, not from a distance, there's something from that, or a body's obtained to where somebody, do I think our government knows about it? Yeah, I do. I think, like anything else, I think the information is being suppressed. When you even get into the missing 411 with David Paulides and some of the stuff that goes on from that perspective, how that ties into it. I do think that, information is being suppressed. I think there is evidence out there, but until somebody within our group or hunters or whatever the case may be, discover a body or find a body and get the bones and we can get it analyzed, there's always going to be that skepticism across the board. And even though it's become more mainstream, I had somebody ask me the other day, why haven't, I said, well, you know what, I'll tell you what, there's portions of the South down here, in the swamps, Pacific Northwest, where there's areas of this country that just maybe nobody's been to, or people won't go and trek. We found footprints, my wife and I found it in the middle of a swamp in a high park. I've showed those footprints to people and they're like, well, how do you know it wasn't a person? Well, how many people are going to be 3 miles deep in a swamp and walking around in their bare feet, right? But I think there's just a lot of, our nature is to doubt. But I believe the information's there. I believe somebody has it. But until we can pull a body out and say, look, everybody, this is what we have, I think there's always going to be skepticism. And I mean, if we're into cryptids, UFOs, and you even want to get into ghosts and other thing from the standpoint, you have to have a pretty open mind at this point in order to investigate it, but be curious in what you're doing.
I think a lot of it has to do with not accepting it, not just because there isn't a body, but also because it just changes the dynamics of the way we think about life and reality, and this creature's not supposed to exist, and here it is, and it's kind of a dangerous looking creature, whether it's actually dangerous or not. It plays havoc with the psyche of a person, so the fear factor would prevent them from even acknowledging it.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And, that's something you said right there, that, if these things being out there, and let's just say our government knows this, right? And you get into the state parks and look at the disappearances people. Now, I'm not going to say it's tied to Bigfoot. I believe there's a lot of other things going on from that perspective. But can you imagine the panic that would ensue if maybe that information was shared with the general public? I sometimes I think that our own government thinks they know what's the best for the people out there, even though they may not be right.
Well, I've also heard, it could change industries, various things like that. Also, there'd just be a lot of complications come from it.
Absolutely. That is a great point.
The other factor is, what if these things have some relationship to humans? And we have to start then considering what would their rights be.
That's a great point, Linda. I mean, how many times have you heard stories of hunters being in the woods and, they've scoped something in, and when they've looked, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what this creature is, but it's staring at me. And some of the same responses, well, did you pull the trigger? No, because I looked into the eyes, and presented itself in a non-threatening manner, and I just couldn't do it because I felt compassion that I was looking at another being that thought and presented itself that they couldn't do it, right?
Exactly. And I think that it just puts a whole can of worms into that, because where do you classify them? Where do they go from there?
That's and it I think a lot of people, because they want to mock, they don't believe in this, but there's new species discovered every day, right? And I think the evidence is so suggestive that you get a lot of these footprints, you get the dermal ridges that are in there, that even actually sometimes when you get a very clean print, you get a small portion of dermal ridges. We had something very similar to that on what we think was a juvenile print, but I think it's the human psyche. And listen, there's good people out there. They're great people. They're bad people. And I think, from any perspective, I think that even goes into, the stories we get within this. But it's a very complex matter. And then if you tie your faith into it and how you come from belief of that, there's a lot of complications, twists and turns that I think will play into thoughts and what you feel is right and wrong.
Well, especially if you pull in the whole paranormal factor into this, and the very, very strange and odd behavior that we sometimes hear about. Where do you put that? I mean, that's another ball game of things that we don't accept generally as a society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, the open minds aspect comes in, because I mean, as human beings, we use a very small percentage of our brain, right? It's gone into factors like on the television. If they change frequencies from a television set, from what is it, 445 to 454 or lower, it impacts the way we think, our psyche, and everything from that. Well, everything is made up of molecules with different frequencies. And that's where, I kind of got into earlier about getting into the paranormal aspect. If people are able to change their vibrational frequency, we've seen, different things happen, and there are different dimensions. That's been proven through science as it is right now. From that standpoint. So how do we know that maybe through changing your vibrational frequency, that there isn't some movement that you can do between dimensions based upon that changing of your frequency, or the molecules that are made within your body? Just because we don't know how to do it doesn't mean it can't be done, but there is science that backs that.
I think someone said the other day in an interview that as human beings, as we know ourselves to be, we went into technology, and that's where we really focused and accelerated. But maybe these creatures accelerated in a different area. Maybe they accelerated in the idea of being able to use these dimensions or different frequencies, and learned how to use that as a survival skill.
I agree 100%. I mean, I think it's something, I can just say from a personal perspective, when I was younger, I had a lot of experiences as a kid where I've seen shadow people. There were times where I would actually dream something, and a week or two later, it would come to fruition on how I dreamt it. So I've lost that. So is it something that as you get older and you gather more information and your mind closes down, or through other things, that becomes less and less likely? I mean, other people, there's so many people who are more in tune to different things, and a lot of that comes through how you're using your mind. And if we're only using a small percentage of that, what are the capabilities of, if we can increase that? I mean, you see people, levitate certain items, as well as being able to put a spoon in their hand and making the spoon bend. Why are they able to do that? That's been proven. I mean, the Russians were really, the Nazis, when you even go back to World War II and their aspect of what they honed into, they believed in this supernatural and powers from that perspective. And our space program came from Operation Paperclip, from bringing all the scientists over from Germany after World War II. I think we become, as a society today, we become a very soundbite society. And so many people today really don't sit down and look at both sides of an equation or an argument, or look at the history. And we're so dismissive today because we have all this technology we didn't have, had in the past. I mean, going back to when I was a kid, I was the channel changer in the house. There was no person to change the channel, but we have so many technologies today. And I think people have, to some extent, have stopped really thinking and taking a look at things and putting some rationale behind it. But I mean, when you get into even into Egypt, petroglyphs, hieroglyphs, whatever the case may be, there's evidence there that suggests there was technology from the past. But do most people accept it? No, because it doesn't make sense. We don't want to give credence that somebody from that age had anything that was available to them that would surpass, or equal to what we have today.
Exactly. And I'm sure that even if people were willing to acknowledge that Bigfoot exists, it would be even harder to believe that they go from dimension to dimension or disappear in front of your face.
Yeah, you're 100% right. But there's some really good stories out there from credible people, people who had been in the military, police officers who are trained to collect facts. And, there's one story I listened to in particular where it was in the Pacific Northwest, and I can't remember what state, but somebody was coming into an open field, and there were, mountains on either side of them. And they witnessed a creature kind of searching for what looked like to be a portal opening on the side of the mountain. And they kept looking back, and all of a sudden that person looked away for a second, looked back into the spot, and the Bigfoot was gone. Well, how does something disappear when you had eye contact? You tracked it for several minutes, you look away for 1 second, the actions of that particular Bigfoot, as they said it looked like it was searching for, I don't know, lack of a better words, like a button on the side of the mountain. You get into various mountains, you get into granite, you get into crystal, those create vibrational frequencies too. They all play a different aspect into it. So when you hear stuff like that from a credible witness and all of a sudden it disappears, you've got to keep an open mind.
Absolutely. And there are so many of those stories out there. And a lot of people that are real flesh and blood only. And I do believe that these things are flesh and blood, but I think they also have some other aspects potentially because there are too many stories out there. So I will oftentimes ask the question, have you seen UFOs with them? Have you seen orbs with them? Is there anything unusual that happens around a Bigfoot? I understand you haven't had enough experience with those, but you certainly are a researcher and out there hearing those stories, I'm sure too.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got one, our group has a very diverse background. We've got one gentleman who works for the news out here in the Tampa area, and he grew up in Georgia and lived in Texas for a while, and he had a very similar experience that he would tell about orbs and then getting a UFO experience off of it in North Georgia, and he did not witness a Bigfoot, but had enough from tree snaps and everything in the background, then seeing an orb, and then later a UFO that came across, which really sits there and makes you think. And just because I didn't have that experience doesn't make his experience any less true. I know him to be a very credible person, works within the news industry, and you've always got to take into consideration, once you know the character of an individual, their experience has to make. Now, can something be misidentified? Absolutely, but you've got to take everything into account.
For sure, yeah. So what else can you tell us? What else do you want to talk about?
I think from a perspective is, if you're doing this, I think as a community, we've got to do a better job of sharing with one another. As I mentioned, we've got some really great groups here in Florida. David Sadati's got a group, Marie Dumont. We've been out working with Creature Man, which is Stevie Strings down in the Mayaca area. Dave Shealy's down here with his skunk ape perspective. But I think as a whole, I would like to see the groups do more collaboration, being able to share locations, and I think from a perspective too of just gathering information and using a more scientific approach. A lot of stuff gets thrown out on social media, and sometimes I wish it was vetted before, we get, as we get these reports, and I wish there was more vetting sometimes before. I'm very cautious of posting stuff either on my social media or through our group. And very cautious of saying what I think it is. Sometimes I will post things out there and let people talk, but I will never come out and say. I do get frustrated a lot of times, and we see it a lot today, where people just circle a photo, and a lot of and you'll look and you're like, what am I looking at? What is that? And I think that's sometimes where I think I get frustrated from the standpoint, if you have to circle it and I have to hunt to try to find it, I have problems with it. And I think that's where the dilution comes from, to where the general public comes in. And, we have a lot of, when you look at groups and you get out and look at what people post, I think some people do a really good job at it. There's groups out there that do it, but I think we have to be careful in how we present this information to others, because it's the everyday people out here who are going on, taking a look at the evidence at hand, and we've got to be careful in how we present it and what we're claiming, because that's where the cartoonish stuff comes into play, right? Is where we start getting mocked, and I think as a overall group, where the skepticism comes in. If we have something out there that's so elusive that doesn't want to be found, that are trying to, and you're going out there and you're having an experience every time, to me that's next to impossible. As long as I've been doing this, like I said, 95, 96, 90% of the time, nothing happens. It's just a nice day in the woods. It's a nice day with, nature, and it's a nice day with your friends out there that you're sharing with it. And I think that's where we've got to be very careful as a group and as a whole of what we because with my experience that I stated with, the talking, I wish I would have started my recorder. I didn't think about that. I instead had my camera out trying to get some photos. I've had times where, I have a parabolic ear that we put out when we're, you think you hit the start button overnight and all of a sudden it didn't record. There's just so many missed opportunities out there. I've had a lot of great experiences that I could share with with people. And I think we've all had great experiences, especially when you get out there with the amount of stories you hear and tell. Um, but until we actually, as you stated earlier, we get proof on something, or you can present something, concrete. I shared a photo of you where it looks like two of the same footprint out in the swamp, and my wife and I, we went out into this area by ourselves. It was an early Saturday morning, and we hiked the trail, and 4.5 miles out, it was kind of a question mark on how we went around, came up, went around this way. And for one reason or another, we were just enjoying ourselves. I didn't bring any equipment. We did have some boots on, but really nothing. It was just one of those days where you're out in the woods. I'm not really bigfooting, but we're just hiking. And I love hiking, kind of a passion of mine. And all of a sudden we looked, and my wife's like, "Oh my gosh, we've got to be out with our friends at 2 o'clock." And it's, what was it? I think it was about noon. And I'm like, "Oh my God, we're 4.5 miles away if we go back to the same route we have." So I said, "It's a mile if we cut through the swamp, right?" And she's like, "Yeah, okay, let's do it." So we're going through the swamp, and God bless her for being such a trooper. And we're going through knee deep water, through, and like the swamp, you go high spot, low spot, high spot, low spot. So we see a couple hogs back there. Thank goodness they didn't do anything. They just kind of ran away. But we got to that high area, and those two footprints that I have that look like the toes that I sent you. There's two that are almost identical to each other, in the middle of a high spot. You know what I didn't bring with me? I didn't have my casting powder with me. I had basically nothing that I could have taken this. And, I pinged it on. I use a lot of Map My Hike and whatnot. And I pinged it on there. And, but it was just one of those times. There I go again. It's when I'm least prepared, when I least expect it, and I'm just kind of out there hiking, is when I tend to have more experiences than actually, hey, we're on an outing, we're actively looking, we're splitting up, and it just seems everything always happens when I'm least prepared.
That happens, I know, and it has to be very, very frustrating, but still amazing that you came upon those footprints on your way through when you didn't even expect to go through them.
Yeah, it is, but it's a cool picture, and once again, it's a cool story. But I didn't get that casting, and so there's nothing I can do with that. It looks good, but people are like, "Don't you think somebody?" I'm like, "No, this was in dead middle of the swamp. Nobody's walking," and that's the big thing. I have a lot of people who gotten past the point, friends I grew up with have gotten past the point of laughing or mocking me, or whatever the case may be, and they'll be like, "Well, how do you know that's not a person?" I said, "First off, we're in Florida, we're in the swamps, there's snakes, just tumultuous. You've got leeches, ticks down here are just, and I'm sure ticks everywhere are just out of control. Nobody's walking 3 miles deep in the woods in bare feet. I'm sorry. And if they are, more power to them. But, that particular print, if I had to guess on it, was about 18 inches long based upon my foot, being 12 inches. And the stride on that, we tried to get it, just to where I could step it off. And the photo I have of that didn't come out very good, but the stride from end to end, we were looking at about 39-inch stride, which is a fairly good stride. But then the swamp picked back up on the other side. I really only had two prints that I could basically find out that, and that was a needle in the haystack moment, because you had mentioned earlier about finding footprints by structures out there. Yeah, sometimes you do, but sometimes you have to get off. In my opinion, if you're doing this, you've got to do a lot of bushwhacking, because there's a lot of stuff you're not going to find on the main trail. Yeah, once in a while you will, but if these things are elusive, if they don't want to be found, are they going to be leaving signs and just, a lot of the stuff that we see, that's where I kind of come in. That's where my questioning comes into, is they don't want to be found, but they're leaving this much evidence behind. I think they're very cautious and prudent where they step, how they step, especially when you get into areas to where you get more foot traffic, like let's just say maybe the Appalachian Trail, even though we get sightings out there. We get a lot of sightings down here where they go through the power lines, and that would make sense because power lines, when they cut it through a forest, sometimes they're like a natural highway, but you get a lot of high grass in there. There's very low opportunity for, especially in here in Florida, swampy, grassy, and you're not going to get a lot of opportunity to obtain a footprint.